In the small town of Willow Creek, Massachusetts, stood an old mansion that the locals called the House of Whispers. This house has long been covered with legends and rumors. It was said that in the early 20th century, here lived and tragically died a famous horror writer, Jonathan Crawford. His works were so dark and frightening that even his contemporaries considered him a little crazy. But after his death, the house became empty, and since then, people have claimed to have heard strange noises, seen silhouettes in the windows, and felt ice cold when passing by. A young couple, Sarah and Michael Jensen, moved to Willow Creek to escape the hustle and bustle of the big city. Sarah had always dreamed of being a writer and Michael was an architect. They were fascinated by the old look of the whispering house and decided they could breathe new life into it. Despite warnings from locals, the couple bought the mansion and moved in. "These are just old bikes," Sarah said with a smile as she unpacked the boxes. "There's real magic going on in places like this. I might even write my first novel here." Michael only nodded, but his gaze lingered on the shadows that seemed to move in the corners of the room. He felt uneasy, but he didn't want to show it. Their first night in the house was uneasy. Sarah was awakened by a knocking sound coming from the study on the first floor. She woke Michael, and they went downstairs together. The office door was ajar, and a dim lamp flickered inside, though the electricity hadn't been turned on yet. "It's probably just old wiring," Michael muttered, but his voice trembled. As they entered the room, the lamp suddenly went out, leaving them in complete darkness. Sarah felt something cold touch her shoulder. She cried out and grabbed onto Michael. There was an old yellowed book on the desk. Scratched on its cover were the words, "They're watching you." The next day, Sarah decided to explore the house looking for inspiration for her book. In the basement she found a box of notes that turned out to belong to Jonathan Crawford himself. They were drafts of his failed novels. The pages were covered with confusing scribbles that looked more like suicide notes than literary works. One phrase stood out among them, written in red ink. "Don't write here. The house belongs to them." Sarah laughed at it, thinking it was another hoax, but soon began to notice the oddity. Every night as soon as she sat down at her desk to write, the house would come alive. Whispers echoed from the walls, lamps flickered, and shadows danced in the corners of the room. Every now and then, she felt someone watching her. Michael, who was working on the restoration of the house, began to notice that tools were disappearing and his drawings were covered with strange marks that looked like writing. He tried to convince Sarah that something was wrong with the house, but she only waved it off. "It's just our imagination. We're tired because of the move." After a few weeks, Sarah began to change. She became obsessed with working on her novel, almost never leaving her office. Michael noticed that she stopped sleeping and eating, and her eyes were full of a strange gleam. One night, he decided to look at her manuscript. There were no words on the pages, just meaningless scribbles, repeated phrases. "They are here. They demand a sacrifice." Michael tried to talk Sarah into leaving the house, but she only laughed in response. "I finally found inspiration. You don't understand, Michael. Their presence helps me write. They want me to finish." That night, Michael heard a loud scream from the study. He ran into the room and saw Sarah standing in front of the mirror, her hands stained with ink and a sinister smile frozen on her face. In the reflection of the mirror behind her stood a tall, dark figure with faded eyes, staring intently at Michael. Michael realized that action had to be taken. He reached out to old-timers in town and learned that Jonathan Crawford didn't just die in the house, he was found dead at his desk, with the same book that Sarah and Michael had found. It was said that he had been trying to complete his final work, but the house had consumed his soul to use it for its own sinister purposes. When Michael returned to the house, he found Sarah in the basement, surrounded by candles. She was reading strange phrases from Crawford's manuscripts, and the shadows grew thicker around her. "You don't understand, Michael," she said quietly, without turning her head. "They want me to finish what he started." Michael grabbed the manuscripts and threw them into the fireplace. The room filled with a deafening scream, and the shadows began to fade. Sarah fell to the floor, passing out. A few weeks later, Sarah and Michael left the House of Whispers. Sarah still couldn't remember what happened during their last days there, but she never wrote again. The house was left empty, and locals claimed to have heard someone typing on an old typewriter at night afterward and a quiet voice whispering, "Don't forget me."